So anyway, on to the purpose of this video. If we lived in a normal existence where the truth reigned supreme, as it were, and the media had our best interests in mind, this would be front page news. It would be everywhere. But of course, that's not the reality of the situation that we find ourselves in. So I'm going to do my best to raise some awareness of this. Daily exposure to blue light may accelerate aging, even if it doesn't reach your eyes, study suggests. This is from October 16th, 2019. Prolonged exposure to blue light, such as that which emanates from your phone, computer, and household fixtures, could be affecting your longevity, even if it's not shining in your eyes. New research at Oregon State University suggests that the blue wavelengths produced by light-emitting diodes, or LED lights, damage cells in the brain as well as retinas. The study, published today in Aging and Mechanisms of Disease, involved a widely used organism, the common fruit fly, an important model organism because of the cellular and developmental mechanisms it shares with other animals and humans. Oh, now I'm going to struggle with this name. Yaga Giboltowicz, a researcher in the OSU College of Science who studies biological clocks, led a research collaboration that examined how flies responded to daily 12-hour exposures to blue LED light, similar to the prevalent blue wavelength in devices like phones and tablets, and found that the light accelerated aging. Flies subjected to daily cycles of 12 hours in light and 12 hours in darkness had shorter lives compared to flies kept in total darkness or those kept in light with the blue wavelengths filtered out. The flies exposed to blue light showed damage to their retinal cells and brain neurons and had impaired locomotion. The flies' ability to climb the walls of their enclosures, a common behavior, was diminished. This is a really interesting part of it. Some of the flies in the experiment were mutants that do not develop eyes, and even those eyeless flies displayed brain damage and locomotion impairments, suggesting flies didn't have to see the light to be harmed by it. Let that one sink in for a second. Perhaps I should read it again. Some of the flies in the experiment were mutants that do not develop eyes, and even those eyeless flies displayed brain damage and locomotion impairments, suggesting flies didn't have to see the light to be harmed by it. And remember, this is an experiment that was surrounding LED lights, blue wavelengths, which we are surrounded by on a daily basis now, which everyone is holding in their hand. Now, granted, the phones use a different form of LED lighting. It's OLED. And there's a whole technical schematic to why it's called that and referred to in that way. But at the core of it, it's an LED light. The computer screens are LED for the most part. And then, of course, there are the LED televisions. And then, on top of that, we have the LED lights. As far as light bulbs are concerned, and LED headlights in cars, and the list goes on and on and on. There is a saturation of light-emitting diode technology in our immediate environment that we are exposed to. And here we have a study that's saying that even the flies without eyes that weren't looking directly at the light were being impacted by that light. The fact that the light was accelerating aging in the flies was very surprising to us at first. We'd measured expression of some genes in old flies and found that stress response, protective genes were expressed if flies were kept in light. We hypothesized that light was regulating those genes. Then we started asking, what is it in the light that is harmful to them? and we looked at the spectrum of light. It was very clear cut that although light without blue slightly shortened their lifespan, just blue light alone shortened their lifespan very dramatically. Natural light, Guy Bultowitz notes, is crucial for the body's circadian rhythm, the 24-hour cycle of physiological processes such as brainwave activity, hormone production, and cell regeneration that are important factors in feeding and sleeping patterns. But there is evidence suggesting that increased exposure to artificial light is a risk factor for sleep and circadian disorders, she said. And with the prevalent use of LED lighting and device displays, humans are subjected to increasing amounts of light in the blue spectrum, since commonly used LEDs emit a high fraction of blue light. But this technology, LED lighting, even in most developed countries, has not been used long enough to know its effects across the human lifespan. Just going back to the beginning of this paragraph right here, there is evidence suggesting that increased exposure to artificial light is a risk factor for sleep and circadian disorders. I can testify from my own experience that when I spend a lot of time in front of the computer screen, I often have a very difficult time falling asleep that night. And this is obviously due to the fact that the blue light is disrupting my natural circadian rhythm, where if it had not been subjected to that light artificially, the day-night cycle would have resulted in my body naturally winding down, beginning the production of melatonin, and kind of getting me into that mode where I'm ready to fall asleep. So that part of it is relatively obvious. We've all experienced it. But I think this is raising a whole different issue, which is quite disturbing, in the sense of this is kind of the first scientific study that is pointing towards problems on a scale that are potentially much more detrimental to the survival of the human species as a whole. We're being saturated increasingly by LED artificial blue light, and here with the common fruit fly, they're showing that the light is accelerating aging in the flies. And not only that, but disrupting certain behaviors that are common, certain locomotion impairments, brain damage. And this was occurring in all the flies, but also in flies that didn't even have eyes to view or absorb the blue light through. And this has so many wide-ranging implications that I struggle to even know where to begin. Hopefully a lot of it is just coming through intuitively through my voice into the recording, so you understand how incredible this is on so many different levels. If there is something to this study, adapting to blue light will change the circadian rhythms that are passed down generationally. A different type of human will emerge. If our saturation with this blue light continues, and it is affecting us in the way that this study is showing that it is affecting fruit flies generationally. Obviously, it's a relatively new technology that we are being exposed to, and it has not been around for an entire lifetime of one human being. So we have no idea what the effects will be generationally. However, we can look at how the children are interacting with this technology from the perspective of morphic resonance and see how the habit is being transferred generationally from, say, a millennial to their child versus how it was transferred from, say, a boomer to their child, who, of course, then was the millennial who had the younger child that we would view now as, say, a 5-year-old, who would be the grandson or granddaughter to the boomers. We can see how those children have a certain familiarity. They have a certain adaptation that allows them to easily interact with this technology. But that's just the technology itself, right? There's this whole other angle to it now that's relating to the light itself and how that light is potentially damaging our ability to have a normal circadian rhythm, or at least a circadian rhythm that is functioning as it used to function before the advent of electricity or any of this current technology that has followed from that original invention. Circadian rhythm is directly tied to the Schumann resonance and the actual frequency that is oscillating in the cavity of the Earth between the surface and the ionosphere, which we then resonate with, and which informs our general connection to life. And circadian rhythm is a huge part of that, the sleep-wake cycle, sunrise, sunset. And sure, we all know, like I said, that there's some interruption taking place here when we're exposed to a lot of this blue light. But I don't think we've really been able to put the pieces together like something as intense as this study is showing to us. The implication as the generations progress is going to be a human being that is less and less and less capable of connecting with the ionosphere, with the very heartbeat of the Earth itself. And if that's the case, then obviously humanity as a whole would have less and less capacity to understand their place in creation and their ability to intuit what is true and what is false, what is life and what is death, in the metaphorical sense, what it means to be alive. All of that is going to fade away if what this study is giving us an indication of is true. However, that being said, it's not all bad. So let's just take a deep breath with all of that I just said, and remember that there is also another blue light that has shown itself over the past 20 or 30 years. And that is the light that is emanating from the sun, which we now perceive in a way that is very similar to an LED light. And I was having a thought experiment about this whole thing. And the thought experiment was, let's assume that I'm crazy. I like to start a thought experiment with that premise. That's a good premise, by the way. Just throwing that out there. So let's assume that I'm crazy and I'm the only person in existence that is perceiving the sun in the way that I'm perceiving it. And therefore, I'm just remembering incorrectly how the sun actually looked when I was 10 years old in 1992 or whatever. No, you're crazy. having a faulty memory. You're getting old and you just don't really remember what the sun looked like. It's always been white. And of course, this is what they tell us. Yeah, it's always been white in space. Don't you know? So yeah, maybe, hey, I'm just crazy. Let's go with that thought experiment. And so that got me thinking, well, if something like that happened, if your perception of this dimension changed in some way to where you were perceiving something that no one else around you was perceiving, I mean, it would essentially be pointless to even describe it to them because they would have no context for what you were relaying. They would have no ability to understand where you were coming from because they're just simply not perceiving it in the same way. Continuing with that idea, it became obvious to me why someone who had experienced something beyond this dimension might not even bother trying to explain it to everyone. Because they would just have no context for it. It would be so foreign to their general perception that explaining something like that to them would be pointless for the most part. They would just look at you and say, "What are you talking about? Do you need to go to a mental institution, my friend?" So I totally understand why someone would just, keep it a secret to themselves, or maybe cryptically describe the situation in a way where they don't reveal too many details. This is a little different than that. While I think that thought experiment is useful, this is a little different than that because if I'm crazy, then there's a lot of other older people who are crazy, and this is some sort of mass delusion where everyone remembers, or not everyone, but a lot of the people from certain age groups remember the sun being perceived in a different way. And I'm not going to get into all of the different explanations that are put out there to explain why this is the case. The point is that it's a phenomenon being experienced. So if I'm crazy, this is a mass delusion, and we are all perceiving the sun in a different way than we did in the past. It has this blue-white glow to it now, where it doesn't look anything like the yellowish hue that it used to have. But going back to what I alluded to along these lines, some of the flies in the experiment were mutants that do not develop eyes, and even those eyeless flies displayed brain damage and locomotion impairments, suggesting flies didn't have to see the light to be harmed by it. Now, this is in the case of the artificial light, so in the context of all the brain damage they were witnessing and the locomotion impairments, the light was harming the flies. However, we're in a situation where we're talking about the sun. We're talking about that which provides life to this realm. So its light would not be harmful in that way, other than in the way that, hey, if you stay out unprotected in it for too long, you can get burned if your skin is not melanated enough to protect against that. Sure, a little thing like that, it can harm you in that way, but we're talking about deeper levels of existence here, different realms and dimensions where this light is interacting with us. And so how amazing, right, that those flies that didn't have eyes were still negatively impacted by the artificial LED blue light, which if you draw that corollary across to the actual sun itself, well, even if it's some sort of dimensional shift that only certain people are perceiving, well, that light is still affecting those without the eyes to see it. So this is a shift of the ages, as it were, if we go with the hypothesis that the sun has actually shifted its resonant frequency, and it is impacting everyone, regardless of whether or not they are aware enough to perceive it. And, some of that is just a function of your age. If you're 18 years old listening to this, you have really no basis to understand what I'm saying because you simply were not here when the sun was resonating at a different frequency and thus being perceived by us as a different color. So it's not even an age thing or like it's not anything that has anything to do with your own awareness, really, on that level. It's impacting everyone. And that's pretty incredible, right? And so it's surely not an accident that as this trend is taking place, and we're seeing everyone start to question what's going on and become aware of what's going on, that we have everything that's going on in the news and what is presented to us as the real world, all this fear, negativity, hate, anxiety. We have all that going on under the surface. And then on top of that, we have the LED lighting revolution taking place. Let me read this to you just so you see what I'm getting at here. This is from Think Progress. The rapid adoption of LEDs in lighting marks one of the fastest technology shifts in human history, Goldman Sachs stated in a new report. Now, this report is from 2016, I believe. The accelerated deployment of light-emitting diode bulbs is on track to save U.S. consumers and businesses $20 billion a year in electricity costs within a decade, which would lower U.S. CO2 emissions by some 100 million metric tons a year. The growing global effort to speed up LED adoption could ultimately cut global energy costs and carbon pollution 5 times as much. So you see what I'm getting at here, how as this is taking place, as this trend is going on, we have the man-made global warming climate change narrative being wedged into the larger debate regarding what we need to do to quote-unquote save the planet. So as this trend is making people a little more aware, starting to question what's going on with everything that we're doing, and therefore starting to look for a solution to the problems that we are facing. Well, hey, as that sentiment is out there, now we have this idea about, well, hey, here's this new green economy. Here's this new environmental angle that we can all put our energy behind in order to save the planet. Here is the solution. And what is a major part of this solution? Well, it's cutting global energy costs and carbon pollution. And what is the thing that is being promoted as one of the main ways that we can do this? Well, it's LED blue light adoption. That is one of the ways that we can do this. And now, what are they telling us about this blue light? Well, they're telling us that it's causing brain damage and locomotion impairments and decreasing the lifespans of the flies that are exposed to it. So, do you see what's going on here yet? So, as all of that is taking place, we have the LED lighting miracle, which is every bit as remarkable and every bit as unheralded by the major media as the solar miracle, the battery miracle, and the electric vehicle miracle. As recently as 2009, this country didn't have even 400,000 installations of common home LED bulbs, according to the November 2015 Department of Energy report. Revolution, now the future arrives for 5 clean energy technologies. And yet by 2012, we had 14 million. And by 2014, we had a whopping 78 million installations. That is pretty incredible. In 6 years, it went from 400,000 to 78 million. Look at this chart of LED lighting from 2008 until 2014, and it's only increased since then. I mean, this is a parabolic curve. Here's the most important part, of course. This revolution has been driven by sharp cost reductions and performance improvements, relatively short replacement cycles for incumbent technologies, and aggressive policy support, including bans on incandescent technology in major markets such as the US, the EU, and China, as Goldman Sachs has detailed in its recent reports on the low carbon economy. Yeah, just a minor detail that it helped the spread of the LED technology that the old technology was banned. That helped a little bit, right? So, yes, of course, you have all of these official governmental regulations that say, hey, you can't use these incandescent bulbs anymore because they don't meet the new energy efficiency requirements. And it just so happens that these new requirements are being met by this artificial blue light that emanates from LED bulbs that is potentially going to have a disastrous effect in the long term on the human species. And, you know, these LED lights are everywhere. They are the light bulbs, they are the computer screens, the car headlights, they're everywhere. And I just find it so interesting that this shift took place when it did, and you'll see what I mean when I bring up this picture. And that is specifically that the shift in the light bulbs just so happened to mirror the actual shift in the sun itself, on top of all the potential health impacts and circadian rhythm impacts and thus connection with creation impacts that this artificial blue light might be having on us cumulatively, generationally. Well, then you have just the idea here that this change also mirrored the change in the sun from the yellow infrared spectrum to the blue-white UV spectrum. And so, is it a coincidence that this is the technology that was developed, in the sense that for those who did not directly recognize this shift in the sun, it's almost like a replacement, the artificial blue light. It almost distracts you from the reflection of the sun on a clear day, and how it's so bright that maybe if you drive your car at night a lot and you're exposed to these glaringly bright LED headlights that should be banned from existence, but that's a story for another time. If you're exposed to that a lot, or if you're staring at your computer screen a lot, you're just you're not impacted as much by that, by the jarring nature of that reflection, and how it's just so out of place compared to what it used to be. And I don't necessarily think this is a bad thing, as it were. It's just like any other metamorphosis or growing process. There's going to be the growing pains in the beginning as you become what you ultimately are in that process. And so along those lines, this will most likely have a lot of impacts on the climate. It'll have impacts on all sorts of things that could cause some hardship. I mean, just speaking from my own experience, it's so wild to me, the difference between the shade and the sunshine now. As far as the temperature goes, obviously it's always been cooler in the shade than it is in the direct sunlight, but you know, in the middle of the summer, especially when it's really hot out, it feels like a 30-degree difference in the temperature between being in the sun and being in the shade. It just feels like the sun is so much more intense. And that makes sense if it's resonating at a higher frequency and transmitting more energy, more wavelengths of light as a result. That makes sense that it would be more intense. And it makes sense then that this would be having a big impact on all of the things that the sun is capable of interacting with and affecting on a fundamental level. I mean, that just makes obvious, clear, common sense. So yeah, how interesting in the context of all that, that you have the phase out of incandescent light bulbs around the world, and you have all these full partial bans going on all over the place. To the point where you can see where we're headed, where it's literally this artificial environment being constructed on the surface of the earth that will be so disconnected from life. I mean, we're not even talking, we're in the beginning stages here. We're not even talking about when the chips start going under the skin, which they already are. You know, there's chips in people's hands that they're using as a smart device to access all of their various things that they're connected to. You know, what happens when all of this starts getting integrated into the body itself? I mean, it's just going to be on a whole nother level. And I don't have any answers. I'm not trying to stop it. I'm just raising awareness about what's going on. I mean, how could I stop it myself, right? I mean, I'm not going to put that kind of pressure on myself. And neither should you. But all we can do is be aware of it. This is just some incredible stuff, and I just feel pretty grateful to be even aware of it, I guess. I mean, I guess, right? Am I even sure about that? I don't know. Obviously, you go through phases with that where you're sure of that and then you're not sure of that. Sure of it, not sure of it. It's a burden and a blessing at the same time, I suppose. But yeah, I just wanted to raise some awareness about this in the sense of, yeah, I've gone over a lot of this in the past, and a lot of this is kind of rehashed information, but this is quite the study that is out there. And we'll have to see where it goes from here. But yeah, daily exposure to blue light may accelerate aging even if it doesn't reach your eyes. That's quite a study. And I just wanted to make a video to raise a little awareness about it. So hope you guys are doing well, and have a great year.